Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished law professor at Rutgers Law School, author of The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR or on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast is entitled Exporting the War on Terror, Islamophobia in Asia, featuring Professor Khaled Beydoun, who will discuss the latest legal and political developments that have contributed to the troubling rise of global Islamophobia in India, China, and other Asian countries around the world. Let's hear what our guest has to say about why Islamophobia has become such a pervasive global phenomenon.
Welcome, Professor Beydoun, to Rutgers Law and the Center for Security, Race and Rights virtually. Online. I wish we could have hosted you in person, but next year, inshallah, as they say, right?
Inshallah in the future. No, I'm really excited to be here with you, Sahar.
Thank you. We're thrilled to have you. So, well, first, let me just give you a few minutes to do an opening statement and just kind of frame the conversation.
Yeah. So, as you know, I've been studying what is now understood as Islamophobia for more than 2 decades now. Islamophobia is a term that is come into popular parlance and popular consciousness, largely as a consequence of, first the war on terror and the post 9/11 moment. But I would say even more broadly with the Trump administration, we see Islamophobia, really emerge into a cornerstone social and racial justice issue where people beyond the Muslim community and the Arab community really take on the issue and champion the issue as, very much a hallmark racial/social justice concern. So that's been very heartening. And over the last 5 to 7 years, much of my legal research has examined a whole host of what I call structural Islamophobic programs, leading with federal policy that emerged after the 9/11 moment, but more closely and more recently, programs that have a local impact that examine the local policing impact of local law enforcement, police departments across the country, and how they police Muslim communities in very imminent and intimate ways. And beyond this moment, I've really taken a keen interest, and much of this interest on global Islamophobia really emerged from the first book project, the book project you mentioned, the American Islamophobia book, where during promotion of that book and promoting this book internationally, I had the good fortune of meeting Muslims in places like England, France, India, members of the Chinese diaspora, who were asking me a lot of questions about Islamophobia in their respective countries. And even though the first book was tied to Islamophobia as a American policing and racial project, those meetings were fortuitous and really inspired me to want to look more closely as to how Islamophobia was expanding, was unraveling, and was being enforced globally by distinct governments as a consequence of the war on terror moment. So we'll talk more closely during the Q&A. But what I realized during these meetings was that, the United States, through its expansion and peddling of its war on terror policing strategy, but also the language and the lexicon behind the war on terror, was really incentivizing and then emboldening foreign governments to really intensify pre-existing campaigns against indigenous Muslim populations or spur new war on terror campaigns against Muslim populations. So that is what inspired the 2 articles you mentioned that I'm working on, which examine global Islamophobia, and then even more forward, the book that I'm hoping to publish in 2021, examining global Islamophobia more closely.
Great. Thank you for kind of giving us that summary. Let's start by, there's 2 countries, China and India in particular, and hopefully we can expand to other countries, especially when dealing, for example, with what the Rohingya have been experiencing. But let's start with India. And it's been a very contentious issue, the treatment of Muslims within India. There's a long history that's because of the colonialism, British colonialism, and the separation and the war between Pakistan and India and so on. So I think many of us have a deep appreciation for how complicated and complex the situation is, independent, right, of the post 9/11 war on terror paradigm. So could you give us a little bit of perspective on why things appear to be? And I think we have to accept, you and I both appreciate the biases of Western media.
Mhm.
We understand that what we see as people who reside in America is already filtered, right? And it's already curated by American media. And so I want to acknowledge that because I know that there are people who disagree on the facts. So just acknowledging that, yes, these are subjective and highly contentious issues. But why are we seeing such a strong and overt rise of Islamophobia in India, notwithstanding that it's 10% of its population at least is Muslim, right? That's more than 100 million people. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's the largest Muslim population in a country. I believe it's more than Egypt and Iran, which has the very large, right, Muslim populations. So what's going on? Why is this happening? And also, if you could tie it into populism, because as you and I know, this is a big global phenomenon within itself, including in the United States.
Yeah. So India is home to the second biggest Muslim population in the world behind Indonesia. Really sizable Muslim population, heterogeneous, located throughout, the very massive country and subcontinent. And like you said, Islamophobia in India is an entirely a distinct phenomenon, right? Because we think of Islamophobia here in the West largely tied to Orientalism or tied to white supremacy, that, anti-Muslim animus is an outgrowth of the racialization of Muslims as being a non-white caste, if you will, in the West, which cannot be assimilated into largely a white Christian society. Now, in India, it's distinct. It kind of is rooted in entirely different history, where members of the majoritarian and then prevailing party, the BJP, which took over power in 2014, led by Narendra Modi, rose to power by virtue of peddling a very populist vision for the state of India, which was pushing forward this idea of Hindu supremacy. The notion that India is a state that is, should be shaped and should be navigated ahead based on its Hindu identity, right? Sort of this dissolution of the promise that the forefathers of the Indian state made, where it would remain a secular state, where it would, have a staunch sort of separation between church and state, sort of the same safeguard we have here in the United States with the First Amendment. Modi rose to power and essentially did away with that separation of church and state in 2014 by restoring this vision of Bhagat. And Bhagat is this notion of greater Hindustan, right? That India would be remade into a Hindu country. And as a virtue of that symbolism, what that did was that incited, very extremist elements of the country who wanted to restore, a religious caste within that state. You saw mob violence increase in very violent ways against Muslim populations. You saw the kind of mass hysteria that could be analogized with what we saw here in the United States with white supremacists in the Trump moment, happening in a more vitriolic and violent way in India as a consequence of this restoration of Hindu supremacy. So that was the first strand of it, right? I think the best way to understand the rise of Hindu supremacy in India is part of it is entirely indigenous, in the sense that there's this deeply rooted notion of Hindu supremacy that stems from this ideological vision of this party called the RSS. It's sort of the intellectual engine of the BJP, which is the political party that Narendra Modi belongs to. And that notion of Hindu supremacy is what stirred that populism. The second strand is the intersecting opportunity or window created by the war on terror, right? So the war on terror made it palatable for populists like Modi to rise to power and to have these really sweeping indictments of Muslims as being extremists, of being radicals, of being terrorists, with really aligned with the domestic Hindu supremacist vision to castigate the entire population of 210 Muslims who live in that country as being, number one, prospective or putative terrorists, and then second, a population of non-indigenous, non-Indians who cannot be assimilated. And so we see this rising in very frightening ways, most symbolically with a law the legislature passed last year, called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And what that does is, and some have called it the Indian version of the Muslim ban, where entire swaths of the Indian population who are Muslims could be denied naturalized citizenship on grounds of them being Muslim.
There's a lot there to unpack. So, as you know, you and I both focus on Islamophobia in the US and in other places. And we have an appreciation for the real risk of homogenizing a particular minority group, ethnic group, racial group. And we know that any group, particularly if it's defined by ethnicity, race, or religion, is immensely diverse. So when we're talking about India, a country that has more than 1 billion people, there's going to be a lot of diversity among the Hindu population, right? Mm-hmm. And so could you tell us a little bit more about the response to this Islamophobia by Indians who are Hindu, and also, to the extent they're allying with their Muslim compatriots, and what their strategies are, but also what their take is, or what you examine their take to be, of why this is so appealing right now in India, right? Because I think we all know that, look, minorities are, by definition, repressed to some extent in every country because they're minorities. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, based on law, based on politics, based on culture, based on history. So it's not as if anti-Muslim bias is new in India per se. And I don't want to pick on India, because you can pick Muslim majority countries and there's plenty of biases and prejudice against minorities in Muslim majority countries. So please, I want to make sure the audience understands that Professor Beydoun and I are very cognizant of that dynamic. But at the same time, there's always allies, right? And we see it even in the United States with the rise of populism and what we just saw in this certainly a siege and an attempted insurrection. Some people are arguing it was an attempted coup of what happened on the Capitol on January 6, 2021 of this year. So tell us a little bit more about, how this rise in Islamophobia in India is being responded to by Indians who are Hindu, and how they're allying with Muslims, with Indians that are Muslim.
Yeah, I think one danger, especially with the discourse in the West, is, to be very careful not to conflate Hinduism as a religion, right, as a faith group, with this rising moment of Hindutva supremacy, right, which is a political or ideological movement. It's rooted in part in faith, but it's not a religious movement, if you will. It's a political ideology. So from my study of India, there's a whole swath, very disparate and heterogeneous swath of Hindu allies. If you saw the student protest at various universities across India last year, many of the leadership, the student leadership, were in fact Hindu. Some were Sikh, some were Jain. So the movement against Modi and the BJP banner of Hindutva supremacy is definitely comprised of considerable segments of Hindu leadership, Hindu support, but also Sikh, Jain, Christian, and non-Muslim leadership, which reflects, I think, a strong commitment on the ground in India to this promise that the forefathers of the country had to a secular state, right? That at least theoretically speaking, or constitutionally speaking, that the foundation of the nation would be multiculturalism and religiosity. And there are strong sentiments within the state, and again, with the Hindu population, that India, or that promise of India, is being eroded, if not entirely stripped away, by Modi and the BJP's vision.
Okay, let's talk about China. Very different political context, very different history. I did want to note what many of us already know, that India boasts itself as a democracy, right? Mm-hmm. It often even characterizes itself as the world's largest democracy. And it has many political parties, right? In contrast to our two in the United States, or at least the two that get protections, and all the other parties, just the law disadvantages them. But that's a different story. So China, in contrast, one could argue they're kind of proud of their authoritarian government structure under the Communist Party. And that is in some ways portrayed as the secret to their success. And that's the system that they've adopted and that they're proud of, and that they think that's what's gotten us to where we are. But with any authoritarian regime, as we know, opposition to the system is quashed very violently and very aggressively. And so when we were talking about the Uyghurs and what is, as many of us know, or what they self-identify, I believe, as East Turkmenistan, that then creates some problems for them, to put it nicely. So could you tell us a little bit more about the history of the Uyghurs, but to bring it to modern times, similar to India, why is it seemingly at least so extreme right now? And again, I realize it could have always been bad, but right now, at least the media that we're getting, seems that we are seeing a level of Islamophobia that really is unprecedented.
Yeah, so a number of questions come from your presentation. I'll address the first. So the Uyghur are a distinct and indigenous ethnic group to this disputed territory that is currently called Xinjiang, or the Xinjiang Autonomous Region of China, which is this large strip of land in the northwest corner of China that the Uyghur call East Turkestan, right? So this is an indigenous and distinct ethnic group that identify as Turkic. So the Turkic strand or network of nations in that region, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, so on and so forth. The Uyghur consider themselves to be ethnically and culturally more akin to these Turkic nations than the Han-controlled Chinese government. So it's critical to know that in addition to China being an authoritarian government regime, like Professor Aziz spells out, it's also a government that is controlled by a specific ethnicity. The majoritarian ethnic group who are called the Han. And in addition to the communist government looking to sort of entrench and impose communist groupthink amongst the Uyghur to essentially undermine their struggle for self-determination, it's also a racial project, right? The Han are looking to impose Han identity in the same way that white supremacists look to impose white identity on minority groups here in the States, especially during sort of the antebellum post-colonial period, right, where white supremacy was a full-fledged racial project up until 1952 with the Naturalization Act, right? So you saw that happening more sort of brazenly in the United States, but it's happening brazenly in real time in China when we think about the cultural genocide of Uyghurs right now. And the reason it's been ratcheted up more recently, and this is a pre-existing struggle, right, between the Uyghur that was initiated in 1949 with the creation of the modern Chinese state, in which East Turkestan, for a brief period, I think it was up until 1955, had enjoyed some independence, but was then subsequently subsumed by communist China. There's been a perpetual struggle between the Uyghur and Beijing with regard to self-determination and dominion over this disputed territory. The reason in 2016 it becomes more intense is because President Xi institutes what's called the Strike Hard on Terror campaign, and then places a very strident Communist Party leader named Chen Guangguo. And this individual is important to know and to take note of, because Chen Guangguo he had this reputation of being a hardliner, of instituting very draconian and violent policy on minority groups within China. And he sort of highlight why his appointment to Xinjiang was of critical importance. Xinjiang in Mandarin, by the way, means new territory. So Mandarin is the language that the Han speak, and the term Xinjiang translates to new territory. So it tells you kind of the imperial dimension of Beijing's sort of experiment in East Turkestan. But Chen Guangguo headed the policing of Tibet. And we all know that China was very keen and still keen on cracking down on the minority group in Tibet in very violent and concerning ways. So because of his track record of violence and persecution on Tibetans, President Xi posted Guangguo in Xinjiang. And as a consequence of his appointment in Xinjiang, you see the ratcheting up of mass arrests, right, happening. You see the new kind of programming where Beijing was actually appointing Communist Party loyalists to be stationed and quartered inside the homes of Uyghur Muslims of concern. And then you see, most nefariously, which we read about in the news all the time, Guangguo increasing the number of these concentration and prison camps across the territory, which detain up to as many as 2 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims right now being put in internment. So the Strike Hard campaign, which is, very much President Xi's domestic war on terror campaign, fixating on the Uyghur, is what elevates it into a more intense crackdown. And then the appointment of Guangguo in 2016 and makes it far more draconian than it was before.
Okay, so this prompts the question of, It sounds like the way that the Uyghurs are treated isn't that exceptional in the Chinese context. I don't know. I'm posing that question because we see what's been happening with Hong Kong, right? Taiwan, Tibet. And so is the experience of the Uyghurs just an extension of that or part of that? How is that different? How is it the same? And I also want to use this opportunity for you to tell the audience a little bit more about what's been happening with these concentration camps.
Yeah.
What seem to be effectively concentration camps. And perhaps that's also different or not. But provide us a little context there.
Yeah. So it is exceptional. It is distinct. I don't want to kind of get into like oppression Olympics and say that this is more egregious than other forms of, persecution, because all forms of persecution are egregious in their own way. But I will say that what's happening in Xinjiang/East Turkestan is distinct and exceptional in a range of ways, right? I think that in this new paper that I'm working on called The New State of Surveillance, I talk about how, so I'll give you one sort of like prism into viewing it as being distinct, is that China is really keen on, and when I say China, I mean the state, Beijing is really keen on piloting and perfecting its digital surveillance of minority groups within China in Xinjiang on the Uyghur. So what you're seeing happening in real time in the territory is that China, working alongside its most sophisticated leading big tech companies like Huawei, Nick Vision, these huge companies are working to install very cutting edge, very sophisticated surveillance technologies on the Uyghur. And, Sadr, you and I have studied this for a long time. So when we think about preventative and predictive policing with regard to counter-radicalization, if you think about counter-radicalization and the way it's used against Muslims in the West, being bolstered by technology, right, in China, unchecked by the kind of civil liberties we have here. So even though things like privacy and, First Amendment rights are emaciating in the United States, those don't exist at all. There's no kind of buffer within a place like China, which is entirely authoritarian and has no sort of respect and no existence of civil liberties to speak of. So in Xinjiang, the government is able to wield these technologies in ways that are entirely invasive under the logic of preventative policing. So the most benign forms of religious or cultural expression on the part of the Uyghur can be framed as extremist or terroristic under this, and they have laws in place. They passed a law in 2012 called the Chinese Counter-Terror Law, where doing something as innocuous as eating halal meat, right, or observing Ramadan, which was banned in Xinjiang in 2015, can lead you to be arrested and have your phone be monitored as a consequence of the surveillance technology. So the concentration camps are of serious concern. But many of you have read the book 1984, and I know Orwellian sort of analogies are kind of cliche right now. But when we think of Orwellian societies, nothing more than Xinjiang reflects the kind of horror we saw in that book. It is very much the archetypal modern Orwellian society where the territory itself is an open-air prison that is comprised of these range and network of concentration camps that are littered throughout the territory. So that's how it's exceptional.
So let's shift a little let's merge kind of our conversation about China and India to U.S. foreign policy and more the international context. We have some questions by the audience in terms of what's the role of the United States? And obviously we can't talk about that without talking about Trumpism, although I'm not going to give Obama a pass and certainly not Bush. So it's very easy for all of us to just hone in on the last 4 years. And Trump certainly made it very clear what America's longstanding policies have been internationally, at least. So how is U.S. foreign policy, especially the U.S. war on terror, how has that affected, enabled, more specifically, or facilitated the rise of Islamophobia in India and the rise of Islamophobia in China? And again, always interested in what are the differences and what are the similarities between that dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think law, but beyond sort of piecemeal law, is what's most nefarious and most instructive to these governments is the grand narrative, right? Is the grand narrative legitimized by the war on terror that the racialization of Muslims as terrorists, and here I'm using racialization of Muslims as terrorists, citing people like Letty Volk, citing people like yourself, and citing people like Professor Natsu at Georgia State, who have written about this in the post 9/11 moment, that by virtue of racializing Muslims as a putative terrorist threat, what that does is it legitimizes really concerning forms of policing that the United States has championed, right? When we think about the laws that the United States has passed since the post 9/11 moment, leading with Bush, right? Whether it be the Patriot Act, followed by NSEERS, right? NSEERS being this Muslim quasi-registry that took place under the Bush administration. But I think beyond conservative or Republican administrations like Bush or Trump, what I consider to be the most destructive form of structural Islamophobic policing is counter-radicalization policing, right? Because it is not punishing completed crimes, right? It is looking to punish individuals based on the presumption that Muslims might engage in certain sorts of crimes, right? And you've written about that brilliantly and extensively. So we know that counter-radicalization was spearheaded by a Democratic administration, right? So Islamophobia in the United States, as a consequence of laws that are passed by both Republican and Democratic administrations, sort of filters out and communicates to these foreign governments and oftentimes authoritarian regimes like China, or quasi-authoritarian regimes like India, which peddle themselves to be democracies, even though they're declining democracies, that if the United States, the sort of beacon of global democracy and sort of the champion of civil and human rights, is engaged in this project of demonizing and racializing Muslims as putative terrorists, why can't we do the same? Right? And so they've emulated that model. And beyond just emulating that model, it's critical to remember that George Bush, during the embryonic stages of the war on terror, was going to places like China and going to places like India. He spoke to then President Jammeh of China a month after the 9/11 terror attacks to gain his support for the war on terror. So the grand narrative and the foreign policy opened windows these were windows that were widened by the war on terror for these governments to crack down on Muslim populations that they've been keen on cracking down in very intense ways for a long time. Just really quickly, critical race theorists know about Derek Bell and this notion of interest convergence, right? So the war on terror sort of creates an interest convergence moment for these governments, if you will, to crack down on Muslims because it aligns with American foreign policy.
And much of this we've seen in the Middle East, an area that I study in much more depth. And in terms of their justifications of why they shouldn't have to adhere to human rights is because of counterterrorism, that if you have freedom, then you won't have security. And then they use counterterrorism as the pretext for not having to adhere to human rights and continuing to take U.S. foreign aid in order to buy military equipment that then is used against their own people. So that's certainly nothing new in the Middle East, but I do think it's important that we're seeing this phenomena in India and in China. And I think those who are concerned about India preserving its democratic norms and principles, this is the issue of Islamophobia and the scapegoating that's going on that is becoming worse rather than better, is something that hopefully is at the top of their agenda. Now, in light of that, what do you think? You have to speculate. I know this is the time of speculation because we have a new president and everybody's trying to figure out what to expect of him. Now, I will put it out there that my expectations are not that high from a progressive perspective. I think he, at best, will get another Obama. And I think that's being optimistic on issues like civil liberties and surveillance and even foreign policy. But maybe I'm being too hard on Biden and Harris. But what do you foresee? But also, what do you think they should be doing now that we do have a new president? And to the extent their new appointees are listening to new ideas, how can the United States be part of the solution rather than part of the problem when it comes to Islamophobia in Asia?
Yeah, so the romantic in me, which is, I guess, declining with age, would say that the first step would be to really intervene in China, which again, on the eve of the Biden administration succeeding the Trump administration, you saw Pompeo finally brand what's happening in China as a full-fledged genocide, right? And a lot of that was political strategy and sort of gamesmanship. So the romantic in me is sort of hoping that the United States could, and I don't think they will, but I'm just sort of like speaking out loud optimistically, would step in and prevent another genocide, a full-fledged genocide from taking place in China, which is not speculation, right? I think that, some of the more senior folks in the room can remember what happened in Rwanda, might read about what happened in places like East Timor, that of utmost importance is the humanitarian concern, where we sort of curb the prospect of a full-fledged genocide taking place in a place like China. That's the immediate objective. I don't think the Biden administration, for a range of reasons, will do anything beyond symbolic opposition to China on the genocide front. And a large part of that is because of China's economic and rising global hegemony, right? Where it can take place is there's an interesting economic convergence where there's a real Cold War going on with regard to tech and big tech. So China is really competing with the United States to be a global leader on tech and specifically AI. And President Xi, he's announced that he hopes that China will become the global leader in AI by 2030. Now that is, in street talk, talking trash to the United States, which currently, assumes that position. Where you're seeing some criticism of China from the United States is on the economic front, where they're pushing against Chinese tech that they're exporting globally through what they call this digital Silk Road. U.S. companies and the U.S. government is critiquing China economically on account of them being authoritarian, and second, on account of their persecution of the Uyghur. Now, if this can sort of evolve from being sort of limited to the economic context and being more broadly construed on the humanitarian political context, that can bring about some reform. I don't see that happening, but God willing, it will.
Okay. So before we end, I just want to first thank you so much, Professor Beydoun, for taking your time to educate us. I only wish we had more time. I know these are very, very complicated issues. These are issues that you should take classes on, you should read multiple books about, but hopefully we've at least triggered your interest, and we've triggered a conversation that we hope you will take within your respective communities. So with that, Professor Beydoun, what would you like to leave the audience with in closing?
Yeah. No, the first thing I'd like to say is to please support the center at Rutgers and institutions like Sahad. The center that Sahad, Professor Aziz, runs is the only center of its kind in the country, led by one of the leading Muslim scholars on national security. So it's an honor and a privilege to be working with her. And it's important that we support institutions like hers moving forward that really champion this work. So I want to leave you with that. So follow them on social media and definitely support their work moving ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.